Welcome back to BTOS, Beyond the Other Side, where we like to say that our conversations go beyond the obvious. We had a really interesting time last episode, diving into that whole Doll Island thing.
Creepy stuff.
Yeah, it really was. And, you've brought something to the table this time that's got a similar vibe, but also a whole different level of, well, intensity, I guess you could say. The Villisca Axe Murder House in Iowa.
Yeah, this one's got it all. It's over a century old, unsolved murders, and tons of reports about paranormal activity.
Right. And what I find really fascinating about this deep dive is we're not just looking at dry historical facts. We've got the more, official side from Wikipedia. But then you also pulled some really compelling firsthand accounts from those YouTube paranormal investigators. So we get to compare those different perspectives, see how they line up, where they differ.
Yeah, exactly. It's a chance to really get a feel for what happened that night and maybe even what's been happening ever since.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Paint the picture for us. What happened in Villisca back in 1912?
So picture this. It's the early morning hours of June 10th, 1912. Villisca, Iowa, a small town, pretty quiet, you know the kind. And inside this perfectly normal-looking house, the Moore family home, something absolutely horrific is happening.
It's giving me chills already, and we haven't even gotten to the details.
Buckle up, because this is a rough one. 8 people, the entire Moore family, and 2 young girls who were their guests, were murdered in their sleep, brutally, with an axe.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so we're talking Josiah Moore, who was 43, his wife Sarah, 39, and their 4 children. Just to be clear for our listeners, those kids were Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur, who was 7, and little Paul, only 5 years old. And then the 2 guests, the Stillinger sisters, Ina May, 8, and Lena, who was 12, all gone.
Every single one of them. And the way the crime was discovered, well, it adds to the whole unsettling feelings surrounding this case.
We mean?
So the next morning, the Moore's neighbor, a woman named Mary Peckham, she noticed something was off. Well, the Moores were pretty routine-oriented. They'd always be out doing their morning chores, and that morning, there was no sign of them. Mary, she got worried and went over to check on them. When she got to the house, the door was locked, which apparently was really unusual. It wasn't like them to lock up like that. She couldn't get anyone to answer, so she called Josiah's brother, Ross. Ross came over with his key, and, well, he's the one who found them. All of them.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like to walk into that house and find 8 people, including children you knew, murdered. It's beyond comprehension.
It's a nightmare scenario, and the crime scene, the details, they make it even more disturbing.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What did the investigators find?
Brutality, for one. Every single victim was killed by blows to the head with an axe. And get this, it was Josiah's own axe, found lying right there in the guest room.
Oh my God, it just gets worse.
And it gets weirder, too. It seems like Sarah Moore, she was attacked with the blade of the axe, but the other 7 victims, they were all hit with the blunt end.
Okay, so that's a pretty significant difference, right? I mean, was it just random, or could it point to something about the killer's, I don't know, their state of mind or their motive?
Exactly. It makes you wonder, was it rage, was it personal, or was it something else entirely? And then you've got these really strange details from the crime scene that just add another layer of mystery.
Like what? I'm hooked.
For one thing, they found this huge slab of bacon, like 4 pounds, right next to the axe in the guest room. Doesn't make much sense, does it?
A 4-pound slab of bacon? That's bizarre. It doesn't sound like something a killer would just, bring with them.
Exactly. It just raises more questions than it answers. And then in the kitchen, they found food on the table, untouched, like they were about to eat. But there was also a bowl of water there, and it was mixed with blood.
So are we talking about a potential interruption during dinner? Or maybe the killer was trying to clean up?
It's impossible to know for sure, and that's what makes it so creepy. And then here's another weird one, and this is where it starts to feel almost ritualistic, All the mirrors in the house were covered. Blankets, clothing, whatever they could find, they were all covered up.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, that definitely adds a whole other dimension to this. It almost feels like the killer was trying to, I don't know, block something or prevent something from being seen. Right.
And then they found cigarette butts in the attic, which suggests the killer might have been hiding up there for a while, maybe waiting for everyone to fall asleep before they,
That's terrifying. This level of premeditation, it's just chilling. To think that they were up there in the dark watching this family.
And then there's the case of Lena Stillinger, the older of the 2 girls who were visiting.
Right. What was it about her case specifically?
Well, unlike the others, she had a defensive wound on her arm. And her body, it wasn't positioned the same way as the others. It was lying across the bed.
So maybe she woke up during the attack and tried to fight back.
That's what investigators think. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. Her undergarments were removed, and her leg was positioned in a way that, well, initially led people to think there might have been a sexual element to the crime.
Oh, God.
Later investigations, though, they didn't find any definitive evidence of sexual assault. But that detail, it just adds this extra layer of horror and confusion to an already horrific scene.
Yeah, I mean, you've already got 8 people murdered in their sleep, and then you add that element to it. It's just heartbreaking and incredibly frustrating, you know? You want answers, you want to understand why, but it just seems like every clue leads to more questions.
It's a case that defies easy explanation. And that brings us to the investigation itself. You can imagine, after a crime like this, the whole town was in an uproar. They had to find whoever did this.
Absolutely. So walk us through that. What were the initial thoughts, the theories?
Well, the first thing they had to figure out was when exactly it happened.
Okay, so what was the timeline?
Best guess, sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning. And there was another thing that stood out right away.
What's that?
Despite the violence, there was no sign of forced entry, at least not initially.
So does that mean they knew their attacker?
It's a strong possibility. Maybe they let someone in willingly, or maybe it was someone who knew the house well enough to slip in unnoticed. Either way, it immediately narrows down the pool of suspects. And as you can imagine, the investigation was intense. They looked into a lot of people, but a few names really stand out.
Okay, so who are the main suspects? Give us the rundown.
One of the first people they focused on was a traveling preacher, Reverend George Kelly.
A preacher. How did he get involved?
He was in town at the time, leading services at the Presbyterian Church, which, by the way, the Moores attended. He was already kind of known for, let's say, some eccentric behavior.
Eccentric how?
Oh, just a bit off. There were stories about him, little things, nothing criminal, but just, enough to raise eyebrows. And then, get this, he actually confessed to the murders.
He confessed. Wait, so case closed.
Not so fast. He later recanted his confession, said he was pressured into it, and despite the confession, there wasn't enough concrete evidence to convict him. He actually stood trial twice for the murders, but both times the jury found him not guilty.
2 trials and still no conviction. That's interesting. But clearly the suspicion around him lingered.
It did. I mean, how could it not? But there were other potential suspects, too. Another one who came up a lot was Frank F. Jones, a prominent businessman in Villisca.
What was his connection to the Moores?
Apparently, they had a pretty bitter rivalry, business-related. There were even rumors swirling around about an affair between Josiah Moore and Jones's daughter-in-law.
Oh, wow, that's some serious drama. So was Jones considered to have a motive?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if those rumors were true, that's a pretty strong motive for revenge right there. Some people believed he might have even hired someone to carry out the murders.
And that leads us to
William Mansfield, another name that pops up a lot. And get this, he was an actual axe murderer, already convicted.
Oh, boy. So they thought maybe Jones hired him to do his dirty work.
That was the theory.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, Mansfield had a pretty solid alibi for the night of the murders. He was actually nowhere near Villisca when it happened.
So that pretty much rules him out then, right?
Yeah, pretty much. But there's one more theory, and this one's a bit more recent. It came from a book called The Man from the Train.
Intriguing. Tell me more about that.
So this book proposes that the Villisca murders weren't a one-off, a local crime of passion or revenge. They suggest that the murders were committed by a serial killer, a man named Paul Mueller, sometimes called Miller.
Whoa, so they're saying this was part of a larger pattern.
Exactly. The book argues that Mueller was responsible for a whole string of axe murders across the Midwest, all with a chillingly similar MO. He'd target families in their homes, often using an axe that he found right there at the scene, just like in Villisca.
Oh, that's really creepy. So they're basically saying that the Villisca murders were just one piece of a much bigger, more horrific puzzle.
Right. And the authors, they even draw parallels between Villisca and an earlier unsolved axe murder case in Massachusetts, suggesting that Mueller's killing spree might have spanned multiple states.
Man, if that's true, it really paints a much darker picture, doesn't it? It's no longer just about a local feud or a personal grudge. It becomes this terrifying thought that someone was out there systematically targeting families, and no one could stop him.
It's definitely unsettling. And while the Villisca Axe Murder House has this incredibly dark history, its story doesn't end there. In fact, it's become known for something else entirely, something that draws people to it even today.
You're talking about the paranormal, right? The house's reputation as a haunted location.
Exactly. Over the years, it's become one of the most famous haunted places in America, and for good reason. The sheer volume of reports about paranormal activity there is pretty staggering.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What are people claiming to have experienced in the house?
It runs the gamut. People report hearing footsteps when they know they're alone, seeing things move, feeling cold spots, and even feeling like they're being touched or watched. And then there are the voices.
Like actual voices, as in you can hear them talking.
Some people claim they do. There are lots of stories about people hearing children's voices, which, given what happened there, is especially chilling. And then there are the EVPs.
EVPs. What are those?
Electronic voice phenomena. It's where paranormal investigators use recording devices to try and capture spirit voices. And at Villisca, they supposedly recorded some pretty disturbing things.
Like what?
Some EVPs have captured what sounds like children's voices, maybe even calling out for their parents. Others have supposedly recorded the word reverend, which, could be a connection back to George Kelly.
Wow, that's really creepy. I mean, to think that those voices might still be lingering there, it's almost too much to process.
It's definitely unsettling. And it's not just voices. People report seeing apparitions, shadowy figures, and just feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and negativity in the house.
Yeah.
It's like the emotions from that night, the terror and the violence, it's somehow soaked into the walls.
Yeah, I can see how that would make sense. If there's any place where those kinds of emotions would linger, it would be a place where something so horrific happened. So what about these paranormal investigators on YouTube, the ones you mentioned earlier? What kinds of experiences have they reported?
Oh, they've got some wild stories. Some have reported feeling like they were physically touched or scratched. Others have gotten dizzy or felt sudden waves of intense emotions, like sadness or fear. It's like the house itself is messing with them.
And what about the equipment they use, those gadgets and gizmos? Do they ever pick anything up?
Oh, yeah, definitely. They've got all sorts of devices, things like REM pods, which detect changes in electromagnetic fields, and spirit boxes, which some people believe allow communication with spirits. And according to them, these devices have gone crazy in the Villisca house.
What do you mean by crazy?
Lights flashing, alarms going off, the whole 9 yards. And with the spirit boxes, they've supposedly heard all kinds of things, like phrases like, "Release me, I'll kill him," and yes, you guessed it, even the name Reverend coming through.
Okay, so now I really am getting chills. That's some seriously spooky stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then there are these specific incidents, certain stories that have come out over the years that just add fuel to the fire.
Oh, tell me about those.
Well, one of the caretakers of the house, he swore up and down that he heard footsteps upstairs when he was the only person inside. Another time, in 2009, a visitor claimed that the flashlights they were using were responding to questions they were asking the Stillinger girls, like they were trying to communicate.
Oh my God.
And then there was another caretaker who hid in the children's closet, for fun or whatever. But he claimed he felt this really distinct presence, like something was right there with him.
Okay, I'm officially freaked out now. I'd never be able to sleep in that house.
And there's one more story, perhaps the most disturbing of them all. Back in 2014, a visitor who actually brought his own hunting knife to the house ended up stabbing himself in the chest.
What? He stabbed himself. How does that even happen?
It's not entirely clear what happened, but the story goes that he was alone in the house and then for whatever reason, he stabbed himself. Some people say he was influenced by some negative energy in the house or even possessed by a spirit.
Okay, that's just way too much for me. I mean, it's one thing to hear about footsteps and voices, but an actual stabbing, it's too real.
It definitely blurs the lines between paranormal activity and something much darker. And it leads to some pretty interesting theories within the paranormal community about what might be going on in the house.
Like what?
Well, one theory is that the house is filled with this kind of residual energy, like the intense emotions and trauma from that night are somehow imprinted on the house itself. And those emotions, that energy, it could be what's fueling all these paranormal experiences.
I've heard of that theory before. It makes it kind of sense, right? If emotions can be that powerful that they can actually leave a mark on a place.
It's a compelling idea, isn't it? And it makes you wonder, what if those emotions are so strong, so negative, that they can actually influence the people who enter the house? Maybe they're somehow driving them to experience these things, to see and hear things that aren't really there.
It's a chilling thought, but it could explain a lot. Especially those more extreme cases, like the guy who stabbed himself.
Right. It's like the house itself is haunted by the trauma of that night, and it's somehow infecting everyone who steps inside. And then there's this little tidbit that always gets me about the name of the town itself. Villisca.
What about it?
Some folks say it comes from a Native American word that means evil spirit.
No way, seriously. That's either an incredible coincidence or a sign that something was wrong with that place long before the murders even happened.
It definitely adds another layer of creepiness to the whole story.
Yeah.
So here we are with this case that's got it all. A brutal, unsolved murder. A cast of intriguing suspects, conflicting evidence, and then this whole other layer of paranormal phenomena that's been reported for over a century.
Right, and it's up to us to decide what we make of it all. Do we stick to the facts, the historical evidence, and try to piece together a logical explanation for what happened that night? Or do we open our minds to the possibility that there's something more at play here, something beyond our understanding?
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this case so fascinating. It challenges us to confront our own beliefs, to question what we think we know about the world.
Absolutely. So, for our listeners out there, we're throwing it back to you. What do you make of the Villisca Axe Murder House? Is it a tragic story of a senseless crime, or is there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? It's a question that might not have a definitive answer, but it's certainly worth pondering.